It usually happens in the middle of something ordinary, a tense conversation, a familiar provocation, the moment where you would normally respond without thinking, but this time you didn't. You stayed still, you watched, and in that brief pause, something shifted. The room felt different. The other person hesitated. Even your own body softened. Nothing was resolved, yet everything changed. That moment is not weakness. It's not avoidance. It's a change of position. You stepped out of the reflex and into awareness, and from that position, reality no longer behaves the same way. What you're about to explore isn't about silence as restraint or observation as passivity. It's about discovering why the simple act of seeing, without immediately reacting, alters the direction of events, and how becoming the observer is what begins to move reality itself. One of the most subtle traps of human perception is the feeling that life is happening to you from the outside. Circumstances appear as solid facts. People seem to arrive already formed, already charged with intention. Events feel imposed, like weather patterns you can only endure or escape. And without noticing, you begin to narrate your life from a single sentence that quietly shapes everything. This doesn't depend on me. At first, that sentence feels like relief. If it's outside of you, then you are not responsible for the tension you feel, the repetition you live, the weight you carry. Responsibility dissolves into resignation, but that relief has a cost. Because the moment you fully believe reality is external, you also give up the one position from which change is possible. This illusion doesn't shout, it whispers. It hides inside common thoughts. That's just how people are. This is how the world works. I can't do anything about it. Each thought seems reasonable. Together they build a worldview where you are permanently downstream, reacting to forces that precede you. And when you live downstream long enough, reaction becomes your default identity. Notice how this plays out in small moments. A message arrives with a tone you don't like. Instantly something tightens. You say to yourself, they made me feel this way. A delay happens. A plan falls apart. Life is against me today. In each case, the assumption is the same. The cause is out there, the effect is in here. You are the container. The world is the active agent. But this framing is incomplete, and incompleteness is dangerous when it masquerades as truth. What you call outside is never encountered raw. It is filtered, interpreted, weighted, amplified. The tone of the message passes through memory. The delay passes through expectation. The plan passes through identity. You don't experience reality directly. You experience reality as it appears from where you are looking, and where you are looking from is not neutral. It is conditioned, emotional, historical, and usually unconscious. This is why two people can live the same event and walk away with opposite conclusions. One feels attacked, the other feels challenged, one feels abandoned, the other feels free. If reality were purely external, this wouldn't happen. The difference is not the event. It's the position of observation. The illusion then is not that the world exists outside of you. It's the belief that your relationship to it is passive, that you are merely a surface upon which life writes its story. In truth, the story is being co-written in real time by how you attend, what you emphasize, what you resist, and what you unconsciously expect to find. When you believe everything is outside, attention becomes careless. It scatters. It reacts. You look without noticing how you're looking. And because attention is unchecked, it follows the loudest signal: threat, lack, conflict, urgency. Over time, this creates a strange feedback loop. You say, "See, life is chaotic," but you've been tuning the dial to chaos the entire time. This is not about blame, it's about position. If you are standing in the rain, you will feel wet. But if you forget you're standing there by choice, you'll curse the sky instead of moving. The belief that everything is external locks you into the rain while convincing you there is nowhere else to stand. What makes this illusion particularly dangerous is that it feels objective. It feels mature. I'm just being realistic, you might say. But realism without awareness becomes fatalism, and fatalism quietly drains power. Not dramatic power, not the power to dominate or control, but the subtle power of influence, the power of orientation. Because the moment you begin to question whether reality is fully outside of you, something destabilizes. You start to sense that your reactions are not inevitable, that your interpretations are not facts, that your attention is not innocent. And this realization is uncomfortable. It removes excuses. It introduces responsibility at the level of perception itself. If observation is not passive, then where you place your attention matters more than you thought. If your inner stance participates in shaping experience, then your focus is not just a response, it's an input. And that opens a new question, one that doesn't yet have an answer, but refuses to stay silent. If the observer is always present, always filtering, always influencing, can observation itself be neutral at all? That question doesn't resolve here. It lingers. Because once you sense that your way of looking is part of the equation, the idea of a detached, harmless observer begins to crack. And through that crack, another understanding starts to emerge, one where observation itself carries weight, direction, and consequence. There is a comforting idea we carry without examining it, that simply watching is harmless. That observation is passive, clean, untouched by intention. We imagine ourselves standing on the sidelines of life, eyes open, hands off. But this idea collapses the moment you look closely at your own experience, because the instant you observe something, you are already in relationship with it. Even before science touched this territory, you felt it personally. Think of a moment when someone was watching you closely, not speaking, not interfering, just watching. Your posture changed, your breathing adjusted, your behavior shifted, subtly or dramatically. Nothing was said, yet everything was different. That change did not come from action. It came from attention. This is the first crack in the myth of neutrality. In physics, observation alters outcomes at the smallest scales. But you don't need laboratories or equations to understand this principle. Human systems respond the same way. Attention is not a flashlight that reveals what is already there. It is more like a hand placed on a surface, applying pressure. Even light pressure changes shape. When you observe a situation, you bring with you expectations, fears, hopes, memories. You don't see the thing itself. You see the thing through a lens that has weight. And that weight presses into reality. It informs what you notice, what you ignore, and how long something stays in your field of awareness. Over time, this selective pressure matters. Consider how quickly attention feeds momentum. When you watch for mistakes, mistakes multiply. When you watch for threats, danger sharpens. Not because the world suddenly became more hostile, but because your observation is acting like a spotlight that heats what it touches. Focus is energy with direction, and energy with direction produces effects. This is why two people can enter the same room and feel completely different atmospheres. One senses tension immediately, the other feels curiosity. The room didn't change, the observers did, and the room responded accordingly. Conversations followed different paths. Micro-expressions aligned. The field reorganized around the quality of attention present. The influence of observation becomes even clearer when you notice what happens inside you. The moment you watch your own thoughts, they behave differently. A thought you believe blindly feels solid and commanding. The same thought once observed begins to loosen. It slows down. Sometimes it dissolves. Your awareness didn't fight it. It simply looked. And that looking altered the internal landscape. This is not neutrality. This is interaction. The problem is that most observation is unconscious. You are always influencing, but rarely on purpose. You observe from habit, from old emotional postures, from identities that were formed in environments that no longer exist. And because this influence is invisible, you attribute the results to chance, fate, or external causes. You say, "This always happens to me," without noticing that you are watching life through a narrow channel that keeps producing familiar outcomes. Your attention returns to the same themes, the same threats, the same confirmations. Reality seems consistent, but what's actually consistent is the observer's stance. There is a deeper layer here that often goes unnoticed. Observation doesn't just influence what unfolds, it influences what can unfold. Certain possibilities require a specific quality of attention to even appear. If you observe life with suspicion, trust-based opportunities never fully materialize. If you observe from urgency, depth feels inaccessible. Possibility is not only about conditions, it is about the field created by awareness. This is why forced positivity fails. It tries to control outcomes without changing the observer. It attempts to manipulate the surface while leaving the lens untouched. True influence doesn't come from telling yourself better stories. It comes from refining the quality of attention itself. Calmer, steadier, less reactive, more precise. And this refinement begins with a difficult realization. Every time you look at something, you are participating in its unfolding. Not as a controller, but as a contributor. Your attention votes, it reinforces, it amplifies, it gives continuity to patterns that might otherwise fade. Once you see this, neutrality becomes impossible. Even indifference is a form of influence, even avoidance shapes outcomes. The question is no longer whether you are affecting reality. The question becomes how you are affecting it and whether that influence is conscious or automatic. This is where discomfort arises, because if observation influences, then attention carries responsibility. Not moral responsibility, but functional responsibility. The responsibility to notice where your awareness habitually rests and what it feeds over time. And as this understanding deepens, another realization begins to form quietly in the background. If attention has weight, if observation fuels patterns, then whatever you consistently focus on is not just being noticed, it is being nourished. And nourished things tend to grow. There is a simple pattern operating beneath most of your experiences, so familiar that it becomes invisible. Whatever stays in your awareness tends to expand, not instantly, not magically, but steadily, like a muscle that responds to repeated use. Consciousness is not just a light that reveals, it is a nutrient, and what it nourishes develops structure, strength, and continuity over time. You can see this in ordinary moments. A small irritation appears. You notice it once, then again. You replay it, examine it, justify it. Hours later, the irritation has become a mood. Days later, a story. What began as a passing signal grew roots because attention kept returning to it. The growth did not require effort, it required only presence. This is not limited to negative states. The same principle applies to confidence, curiosity, gratitude, doubt, and fear. Each time your awareness rests on something, it gives it time, energy, and coherence. Consciousness functions like a field in which certain patterns are reinforced simply by being held. Most people assume growth comes from action alone, but long before action, there is sustained attention. You don't act on what you don't keep in mind, and what you keep in mind shapes what feels relevant, urgent, or real. Over time, this relevance becomes your lived reality. The danger is not that consciousness feeds things. The danger is that it feeds them indiscriminately. Your attention moves automatically, pulled by emotional charge rather than intention. Threat grabs it. Lack grabs it. Anticipation grabs it. And once captured, awareness stays there longer than necessary, reinforcing the very conditions you wish would change. Think about fear as an example. Fear rarely arrives fully formed. It starts as a vague sense, a question, a possibility. But the moment you begin to monitor it, check for signs, scan the environment for confirmation, fear gains density. Your consciousness is now organized around it. The body responds. Perception narrows. Coincidences appear to validate the concern, and soon fear feels justified, even though it was attention that gave it momentum. This creates a strange inversion. You believe you are observing because something is important. In reality, something becomes important because you are observing it repeatedly. Consciousness doesn't just reflect value, it assigns it. The same mechanism operates in relationships, work, and self-image. If you consistently focus on what's missing in a person, absence grows. If you watch for disrespect, you find it. If you track your own limitations, they solidify into identity. None of this requires intention. It requires only repetition of attention. This is why trying to think positively feels artificial. It attempts to replace content without addressing the underlying habit of feeding. If your consciousness is accustomed to grazing on conflict, it will reject calm as uninteresting. Calm has less charge, less drama, less pull. Until the observer itself changes, the diet remains the same. There is a quieter, more uncomfortable truth beneath this. What grows in your life is not always what you want, but what you consistently attend to. Desire is less powerful than focus. Wishing for peace while feeding anxiety is like watering weeds and hoping for flowers. Growth follows nourishment, not preference. This doesn't mean you should suppress awareness of problems. Avoidance feeds them too in a different way. What matters is the quality of attention. Is it compulsive or spacious, reactive or steady, scattered or deliberate? Consciousness can feed without clinging, observe without fertilizing, but that requires presence, not habit. Once you begin to notice this pattern, you see it everywhere. News cycles thrive on it, social dynamics amplify it, internal narratives depend on it. Entire realities are sustained, not because they are true, but because they are continuously fed by collective attention. And this brings the insight closer to home. If attention grows things, then unconscious attention creates unconscious realities. You may think life is happening to you, when in fact it is responding to what you are repeatedly energizing without realizing it. This realization is not meant to create pressure or control. You don't need to police every thought. That would only create another pattern to feed. Instead, it invites a different posture, a softer vigilance, a curiosity about where your awareness naturally goes when you are not directing it. Because once you see what you are feeding, you begin to notice something else. Many of the patterns you dislike are kept alive not by external forces, but by your own reflex to react to them. Reaction is concentrated attention, and concentrated attention is potent nourishment. Which leads to a subtle but important question that begins to surface on its own. If feeding patterns strengthens them, what happens when you stop feeding through reaction? What happens when attention remains, but without the automatic emotional charge that keeps the cycle alive? That question doesn't demand an answer yet. It simply prepares the ground. Because the moment you see how reaction sustains what you don't want, you're brought face to face with the next threshold. The role reaction itself plays in creating the very realities you believe you are trapped inside. Reaction feels justified. It arrives with speed and certainty, carrying the sensation of necessity. Something happens, and before you even name it, your body tightens, your thoughts align, and a response is already forming. Reaction convinces you that it is protection, that it is intelligence in motion. But beneath that confidence lies a trap that quietly reproduces the very conditions you are trying to escape. Reaction is not awareness. It is awareness pulled into habit. When you react, you're not meeting the present moment fresh. You are meeting it through stored patterns. Old emotional reflexes rise faster than perception. The past interprets the present, and the present is forced to conform. This is why reactions feel familiar. They have been practiced. And what is practiced gains efficiency, not wisdom. Think of how often you say, "I had no choice." Reaction loves this phrase. It frames itself as inevitability. But if you slow the moment down, even slightly, you will notice a gap. A brief opening where something else could have happened. Reaction closes that gap instantly. It fills the space before awareness has time to enter. This is how repetition is born. Not through fate, but through speed. Every time you react, you reinforce the pattern you reacted from. The nervous system learns, the mind learns, the environment learns how to engage you. People begin to play their roles with greater precision. Situations sharpen along predictable lines, and soon life appears to be stuck on a loop. You might recognize this in conflicts that never truly resolve. Different faces, same dynamics, different settings, same emotional aftermath. You leave thinking, why does this keep happening? Without noticing that your reactions are the glue holding the sequence together. Reaction is highly generative. It creates continuity. When you react with anger, you teach the situation to escalate. When you react with fear, you teach it to threaten. When you react with defensiveness, you teach others to push harder. This is not because people are malicious, but because systems respond to energy, and reaction emits a very specific signal. What makes reaction particularly deceptive is that it feels like engagement. You feel involved, alive, responsive. But engagement without awareness is just repetition in motion. It produces activity, not change. There is also an internal cost. Reaction collapses your field of perception. It narrows attention to what confirms the emotion that triggered it. In that narrowed state, options disappear. Nuance vanishes. You become temporarily blind to anything that doesn't support the reaction. And because you don't see alternatives, reaction feels like truth. This is how you end up creating what you don't want while trying to avoid it. You react to disrespect, and conflict intensifies. You react to scarcity, and pressure increases. You react to rejection, and distance grows. The reaction is aimed at eliminating the threat, but it feeds the pattern that sustains it. Over time, this builds identity. You don't just react, you become someone who reacts this way. You tell yourself stories about who you are, what others are like, how the world functions. These stories feel earned, they feel proven, but they are conclusions drawn inside a closed loop. The trap is not that reaction happens. Reaction is natural. The trap is mistaking reaction for necessity. The moment you believe reaction is the only option, you stop seeing its creative power. You see yourself as a victim of circumstances instead of a participant in their continuity. There is a subtle addiction here. Reaction provides stimulation. It gives you something to push against. It creates meaning through conflict. Without reaction, there is an unfamiliar quiet, and that quiet can feel like loss of control. This is why the idea of not reacting often triggers discomfort. Silence feels like weakness. Pausing feels like surrender. But this is only true from the perspective of the reactive pattern itself. Reaction resists interruption because interruption threatens its survival. When reaction is absent, something strange happens. The pattern doesn't immediately collapse. Instead, it intensifies. It provokes. It demands engagement. Life seems to test whether you will return to the familiar response. This is where most people snap back into reaction, confirming their belief that change is impossible. But if you stay present without feeding the reflex, a different process begins. The energy that was once channeled into reaction has nowhere to go. It circulates, it destabilizes the old sequence, and for a moment you may feel disoriented, as if you've stepped out of the script but don't yet know your new lines. This disorientation is not failure. It is a signal. It indicates that the automatic loop has been interrupted, and in that interruption, something new becomes possible. However, possibility only emerges if observation remains clean. The moment judgment enters, reaction reclaims the space. The system reboots, the old story resumes, which is why the next threshold is not about suppressing reaction, but about seeing without immediately labeling, justifying, or resisting. Because once reaction loosens its grip, a new quality of perception becomes available. One where you are in the world, fully present, but no longer possessed by what appears. And from that position, reality begins to behave differently. There is a moment, often quiet and easily missed, when the machinery of reaction begins to slow. Nothing dramatic announces it. No external sign confirms it. What changes is internal. You notice what is happening without immediately naming it as good or bad, right or wrong, threat or opportunity. For the first time, perception arrives before judgment. This moment is the turning point. Judgment usually feels like clarity. It organizes experience quickly. It tells you where to stand. Who is at fault? What must be defended? But this speed comes at a cost. Judgment collapses complexity into conclusion. It decides before understanding has time to form. And once judgment appears, reaction follows automatically, as if pulled by gravity. Seeing without judging interrupts that sequence. When judgment is absent, something unfamiliar opens up. Sensations are still there. Emotions still move through the body. Thoughts still arise. But they are not immediately recruited into a story. They exist as signals rather than commands. You notice tightness without calling it danger. You notice disagreement without labeling it attack. You notice uncertainty without rushing to eliminate it. This is not detachment. It is intimacy without possession. At first, this way of seeing feels unstable. Judgment provides structure. Without it, the mind searches for footing. It asks, "What does this mean?" and receives no immediate answer. The pause can feel like vulnerability, like standing without armor. This is why most people rush back into evaluation. Judgment restores a sense of control, but if you stay in the pause, something begins to reorganize. Without judgment, perception widens. You start to see more than one layer at a time. A person's words and their tone, a situation's tension and its potential, your own emotion and the story you usually attach to it. The field becomes richer, less compressed. And within this expanded field, choice reappears. Choice does not emerge from thinking harder. It emerges from seeing more. When you see without judging, reaction loses its urgency. There is no enemy to fight, no immediate narrative to defend. The body still responds, but it is not hijacked. The nervous system begins to settle, not because the situation is resolved, but because it is no longer being interpreted as absolute. This is where many misunderstand what is happening. They assume non-judgment means approval, tolerance, or passivity. It doesn't. It means you are delaying conclusion long enough to perceive accurately. You are allowing reality to reveal itself without forcing it into categories that belong to the past. And this accuracy has consequences. When you don't judge, patterns that were once hidden become visible. You start to notice how quickly you usually assign meaning, how often you interpret before you observe. How many of your certainties are actually reflexes? This awareness can be uncomfortable. It exposes the mechanics of your own mind, but it also creates space, and space changes dynamics. People sense when they are not being judged. Their behavior shifts. Defenses soften or become more obvious. Conversations take unexpected turns. Situations that once escalated begin to lose momentum. Not because you controlled them, but because you stopped fueling the familiar script. Internally, the effect is just as profound. Emotions move through more quickly when they are not labeled as problems. They arise, peak, and pass. Thoughts lose their stickiness when you don't argue with them or follow them. The mind becomes less crowded, not through suppression, but through clarity. This clarity is not passive, it is alert, alive, and responsive, but it responds from presence rather than habit. You are no longer reacting from who you were, but from what you see now. This is also where life begins to test you. When you stop judging, situations often intensify temporarily. Old triggers reappear with sharper edges. People push familiar buttons. It's as if reality is checking whether the old contracts still apply. Will you interpret this the same way? Will you react as before? This testing phase can be confusing. You may wonder if non-judgment is making things worse, but what's actually happening is exposure. Patterns that were once automatic are now visible. And visibility destabilizes them. There comes a point, subtle but decisive, when a pattern that relied on your judgment can no longer sustain itself. Without your labeling, it lacks structure. Without your reaction, it loses energy. It begins to wobble. You may feel a sense of groundlessness here. The old reality is no longer convincing, but the new one hasn't formed yet. Control slips. Certainty fades. There is a gap where nothing seems to be happening, yet everything is reorganizing. This gap is often mistaken for failure or loss. In truth, it is the threshold where something deeper is about to occur. Because when judgment falls away and observation remains steady, Consciousness reaches a point where its mere presence begins to alter the structure of experience itself. And at that edge, where familiarity dissolves and nothing is being forced, reality does something unexpected. It begins to break from its old shape, as if the pattern you once lived inside can no longer hold under the weight of your new way of seeing. There is a moment when something you once thought was solid begins to fail. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with a quiet instability. The pattern that used to repeat effortlessly starts to misfire. Conversations don't follow their usual trajectory. Emotional triggers lose precision. Situations that once pulled you in now feel strangely hollow. It's as if reality hesitates, unsure which version of itself to present. This is not chaos caused by action. It is collapse caused by presence. When consciousness remains steady without judgment or reaction, the structures that depended on your participation weaken. Every pattern requires reinforcement. It needs attention, interpretation, emotional energy. When that energy is withdrawn, not through avoidance but through clear seeing, the pattern loses coherence. It can no longer organize itself the way it used to. From the inside, this feels unsettling. You may experience a sense of loss of control, as if the familiar rules no longer apply. The mind looks for reference points and finds none. Old strategies don't work. Old explanations feel insufficient. This is often interpreted as confusion, but it is actually reconfiguration. Reality breaks not because it is destroyed, but because it can no longer maintain its previous shape. This breaking point is subtle. There is no explosion. Instead, there is a pause, a gap where outcomes are delayed and responses feel suspended. You might notice that situations linger unresolved longer than usual. People don't react the way you expect. Your own impulses stall before completing themselves. This gap is consciousness at work. In this space, the observer is no longer inside the pattern. You are present, but not entangled. The pattern searches for the old cues, judgment, resistance, desire, and doesn't find them. Without those cues, it cannot complete its cycle. It begins to fragment. Many people retreat at this stage. The discomfort is real. Collapse feels like failure when you're used to continuity. The mind craves structure, even if that structure is painful. It whispers that something has gone wrong, that you should do something, fix something, reassert control. But control is what sustained the old reality. What's actually happening is exposure. The scaffolding that held your previous experience together is being revealed as conditional. It only worked when you observed from a certain position. Now that the position has changed, the structure has nothing to rest on. This is why the collapse often feels personal. You may think you're losing motivation, direction, or certainty. But what's dissolving is not you. It's the arrangement of attention that kept a specific version of reality in place. In physics, collapse refers to a system resolving into a definite state when observed. In lived experience, the opposite can happen. When observation becomes too clear, too present, too free of projection, the old state cannot resolve itself anymore. It destabilizes instead. This destabilization is not random. It follows the withdrawal of unconscious reinforcement. The patterns that break are the ones that required you to believe in them, react to them, or identify with them. Without that belief, reaction, or identification, they lose density. You might notice this in relationships that suddenly lose their charge. The arguments don't land, the roles feel outdated, or in work situations where the pressure evaporates, leaving behind a question you hadn't considered before. Do I actually want to be here? The reality didn't change overnight. Your consciousness did. During this phase, emptiness often appears, not dramatic emptiness, but a quiet absence of direction. The familiar motivations fall away, and nothing rushes in to replace them. This can feel like nothingness, but it is actually uncommitted space. This space is fragile. If you rush to fill it, the old patterns return, sometimes stronger than before. If you stay with it, without interpretation, something else begins to take shape. The collapse creates openness. Without the old configuration, reality becomes pliable. Outcomes are less fixed. Trajectories soften. Possibilities that were previously invisible begin to appear at the edges of awareness, not as clear options, but as subtle invitations. This is where the ego often panics. It prefers a flawed certainty over an undefined potential. It demands decisions, labels, next steps, but forcing form too early interrupts the process. The new reality cannot assemble while you are still trying to control the blueprint. What's required here is tolerance for instability, the ability to remain present while things are unresolved, to allow the break without rushing to repair it. This is not passivity, it is precision. You are letting reality reorganize itself in response to your new way of seeing. Gradually, without effort, something begins to align. Interactions shift. Opportunities appear without being chased. Certain paths close without resistance. The world seems to respond not to your actions but to your state. This response can feel almost eerie, as if reality recognizes that the old rules no longer apply to you. But this recognition comes with a cost. Standing in this space separates you from the comfort of automatic participation. You are no longer carried by the crowd's momentum, and as this separation deepens, another layer of the journey reveals itself. The power of this position is real, but so is its price. Because remaining as the observer through collapse brings with it solitude, silence, and a different kind of strength, one that few are prepared to inhabit. When you stop reacting and remain as the observer, something unexpected happens. The world doesn't rush in to reward you. Instead, it grows quieter. Familiar noise fades. The constant exchange of emotional signals weakens. And in that quiet, you may feel alone in a way you never did before. This solitude is not imposed from the outside. It emerges naturally when you are no longer synchronized with automatic patterns. Much of social life is built on shared reactions, shared outrage, shared excitement, shared fear. When you step out of these currents, you step out of a common language. Conversations still happen, but they feel different, slower, less charged, sometimes strangely superficial. People may not know how to place you anymore. You no longer respond on cue. You don't escalate when expected. You don't collapse when pressure is applied. This can make others uncomfortable, not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are no longer reinforcing the field they are used to operating in. Silence begins to surround you. Not just external silence, but internal. The commentary that once narrated everything loses volume. Thoughts still arise, but they don't demand immediate engagement. Emotional waves pass without pulling you under. This silence can feel like emptiness at first. The mind is accustomed to friction. Without it, there is a sense of weightlessness. Many people retreat here. They interpret silence as absence of meaning. They miss the stimulation of reaction, the sense of belonging that comes from shared emotional rhythms. The pull to return is strong. Reacting again would be easy. It would instantly restore familiarity. But if you stay, silence reveals another quality. It is not empty. It is spacious. And within that space, perception sharpens. You begin to notice subtle shifts in atmosphere, micro changes in tone, the unspoken dynamics of a room, the way people orient themselves toward or away from you. You are no longer caught in the exchange, so you can sense the field itself. This is where power quietly enters. Not the power to dominate or convince, but the power to influence without force. When you are silent and present, your state becomes the signal. You don't need to argue to change the tone of a conversation. You don't need to explain to create calm or tension. Your nervous system sets a reference point, and others unconsciously adjust. This can feel unsettling. You may notice that people project onto you more. Some feel drawn, others feel irritated. Both reactions say more about the field they carry than about you. When you are not broadcasting a clear emotional agenda, you become a mirror, and mirrors make people uneasy. This is the price of power without performance. You also begin to see how often influence was previously confused with effort. You used to push, persuade, defend, or withdraw. Now, simply being present shifts outcomes. Doors open without being knocked on. Conflicts de-escalate without resolution. Or in some cases, relationships dissolve without drama. Loss is part of this price. Certain connections depend on shared patterns. When the pattern collapses, the connection cannot sustain itself. People who were bonded through reaction may drift away, not out of hostility but out of mismatch. This can trigger doubt. You may wonder if you are becoming detached, distant, or cold. But what's actually happening is reorganization. Your field is no longer compatible with dynamics built on noise. And compatibility matters more than intention. With this power comes responsibility, not the responsibility to fix others, but to remain clean in your own observation. The temptation to use this influence for control can arise, to enjoy the effect you have, to manipulate outcomes by withholding or applying presence strategically. This is a subtle trap. The moment you try to use the power, you step back into reaction. Presence becomes a tool, silence becomes strategy. And the field collapses back into ego. True power here is unclaimed. It operates best when you are not thinking about it. As you continue in this way, reality begins to respond differently, not dramatically, but consistently. Situations align with less resistance. Timing improves. Effort decreases. It can feel as if the world is adjusting itself around you, as if it recognizes the stability of your observation. This recognition can deepen the sense of separation. You are still part of the world, but no longer entangled in its constant negotiation. You move through it lightly, leaving fewer traces. And in this lighter movement, another realization starts to form. Influence is not about directing outcomes. It is about creating a field in which certain outcomes become natural. The observer does not push reality by force, but by coherence. This coherence has a frequency, a tone, a quality that extends beyond your personal space. And as you begin to sense it, you may notice something even more subtle. That reality itself seems to be tuning to your presence, adjusting as if responding to a signal it recognizes, inviting you into a different level of participation altogether. Most people are taught, directly or indirectly, that power means control. Control over outcomes, control over people, control over circumstances and timing. When things don't go as planned, the instinct is to push harder, tighten the grip, assert influence through force or persuasion. But this model of power is exhausting, and it rarely produces lasting change. There is another form of power, quieter and far more effective. It doesn't operate by pushing against reality. It operates by shaping the field in which reality unfolds. A field is not a thought and not an action. It is the quality of presence you bring into a situation. The emotional tone of your nervous system, the coherence between what you perceive, what you feel, and how you respond. This coherence communicates continuously, even when you say nothing. You have experienced this before, even if you didn't name it. You enter a space and immediately sense ease or tension. No one announces it, it's simply there. The field precedes the interaction, words follow it. When you try to control, you focus on the surface. You argue, convince, negotiate, correct. You treat each moment as an isolated problem to be solved. Field creation works at a deeper level. It influences the conditions that give rise to problems in the first place. This is why control requires constant effort. The moment you stop applying pressure, the system reverts. Field creation, on the other hand, is self-sustaining. Once coherence is established, others naturally orient to it. Conversations slow down, emotional extremes soften, clarity becomes easier to access. The field you generate is shaped by how you observe. If your observation is fragmented, reactive, or tense, the field reflects that fragmentation. If your observation is steady, open, and grounded, the field stabilizes. This is not a metaphor, it is a lived dynamic. People often misunderstand this and try to imitate calm or confidence. They manage their behavior while their internal state remains chaotic. The field doesn't respond to performance, it responds to authenticity. Any mismatch between inner state and outer expression creates noise, and noise weakens influence. True power comes from alignment. When what you notice, what you feel, and what you do are not in conflict, your presence becomes legible. Others sense it without knowing why. They trust it. Or if their own field is highly unstable, they resist it. Both responses indicate influence. What makes field creation powerful is that it doesn't demand agreement. You don't need others to understand you, approve of you, or follow you. The field operates beneath ideology and opinion. It works on regulation, not belief. This is why a single grounded person can shift the tone of an entire room, not by speaking louder, but by holding a different frequency. Nervous systems attune, pace adjusts, possibilities that were previously inaccessible begin to appear. Control tries to eliminate uncertainty. Field creation tolerates it. And in that tolerance, new information emerges. You begin to sense timing, when to speak, when to wait, when action would interfere rather than help. This sensitivity cannot be forced. It develops naturally when observation is clear and ego is quiet. There is a paradox here. The less you try to influence, the more influence you have. The more you try to steer outcomes, the more resistance you encounter. Field creation requires trust in process, not in outcomes. You hold the space and let reality organize itself within it. This doesn't mean inaction. Action still happens, but it arises from attunement rather than urgency. You respond instead of react. And because the response emerges from coherence, it lands differently. It carries weight without pressure. Over time, this way of moving changes your relationship with effort. You stop wasting energy on battles that don't matter. You stop correcting what would resolve itself if left alone. You become selective, not out of detachment, but out of clarity. Reality notices this, not in a mystical sense, but in a systemic one. Systems respond to stable reference points. When you become such a point, dynamics reorganize around you, opportunities align, friction decreases. Some paths close because they no longer match your field. This can feel uncanny at first, as if life is cooperating without being asked. But cooperation is what happens when you stop interfering with your own observation, when you stop injecting noise into the field. At this stage, a subtle shift occurs in how you relate to causality. You stop asking, "How do I make this happen?" and start noticing what state allows this to happen naturally. This question changes everything, because once you see that outcomes follow fields, not force, your attention turns inward again. You become curious about the consistency of your presence, about what happens when you sustain this coherence over time. And as that coherence stabilizes, something even more intriguing begins to happen. Reality doesn't just respond in isolated moments. It starts to adjust as if it recognizes you, aligning sequences and encounters in ways that feel less random and more conversational, as though a dialogue has begun between your observation and the world itself. At a certain point, the changes are no longer only internal. Something in the way life responds begins to feel different. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but consistent enough that you notice a pattern. Situations seem to rearrange themselves with less resistance. Timing improves. What once required effort now arrives with a sense of alignment. It can feel, for lack of a better phrase, as if reality has started to recognize you. This recognition is not personal in the emotional sense. Reality does not favor or reward. What it does is respond to coherence. When your observation is stable, your reactions minimal, and your presence clear, you become a reliable signal in a complex system. Systems adapt to reliable signals. They reorganize around them. You might first notice this through coincidence. A conversation you were meant to have happens unexpectedly. Information arrives at the exact moment it becomes useful. An obstacle dissolves without confrontation. These events are easy to dismiss individually, but when they begin to cluster, dismissal becomes harder. What's shifting is not the laws of the world, but your position within them. When you are no longer leaking energy through constant reaction, your attention becomes more available. You notice openings that were always there but never registered. You respond to life at the moment it invites response, not before and not after. This precision changes outcomes. Another change becomes apparent in relationships. Some people naturally fall away. There is no conflict, no explanation, just a gradual lack of resonance. Others appear with an ease that feels almost prearranged. Conversations pick up where they need to. There is less negotiation, less friction. Compatibility expresses itself without effort. This can feel uncanny, but it follows a simple logic. When your field is coherent, it filters. You are no longer pulled indiscriminately into every dynamic. Life stops testing you through the same patterns because those patterns no longer find purchase. You may also notice that challenges still arise, but they arrive differently. Instead of overwhelming you, they feel proportional. Instead of triggering immediate reaction, they invite attention. You meet them without the sense of being under attack. And because you are not defending, solutions emerge that would have been inaccessible before. This is where the illusion of randomness begins to soften. Not because everything is predetermined, but because you can now see how deeply attention participates in sequence. Cause and effect feel closer together. You see how a shift in perception alters the path before action even occurs. There is also a quiet hum of trust that develops. Not blind optimism, but a grounded confidence in your ability to meet whatever appears. You stop bracing for impact. You stop rehearsing futures. This frees enormous amounts of energy, and that energy doesn't disappear. It becomes available to life. Reality responds to availability. You may notice this in creative work, in problem solving, in moments of insight that arrive without struggle. The mind becomes a place where ideas land, not where they are forced. This receptive quality invites more. Momentum builds, not through pressure but through continuity. At times, this responsiveness can feel intimate, almost conversational. You act, life responds. You pause, life shifts. You don't attribute meaning to every detail, but you sense a rhythm, a feedback loop between your state and your environment. You are no longer trying to dominate the flow. You are participating in it. This participation brings humility. You realize you are not controlling outcomes. You are cooperating with a larger intelligence embedded in systems, timing, and interaction. The ego relaxes. It doesn't need to claim credit or assign blame. It simply stays present. Yet this stage carries a subtle risk. The mind may try to turn this responsiveness into a method, to replicate it, optimize it, secure it. The moment you attempt to grasp it, the field tightens. Expectation re-enters. Reaction sneaks back in through anticipation. Reality does not respond to demand. It responds to clarity. So the practice remains the same even as the results change. You observe, you stay coherent, you respond when needed, you refrain when not. The simplicity is what keeps the channel open. As this way of living stabilizes, you may find yourself less interested in explanations and more attuned to signals, less focused on outcomes and more attentive to alignment. The sense of being recognized is not about importance, it is about fit. You are fitting into reality as it is, rather than insisting it fit your projections. And in that fitting, life seems to meet you halfway, adjusting its movement in response to your presence. This is not an ending, it is a shift in relationship, a quieter, more precise dialogue between observation and experience, where the question is no longer how to change reality, but how to remain present enough to let the next adjustment reveal itself. What you have been living is not random. It is a reflection of where your attention has been resting, how quickly you've been reacting, and how often you've forgotten the position from which you are looking. The shift you've sensed is not about changing the world by force. It is about remembering the one who is seeing. When reaction loosens, presence becomes clear. And when presence is clear, reality no longer needs to shout to be heard. You stop chasing outcomes and begin to notice how life responds the moment you stand in coherence. You were never meant to be a character trapped inside events. You are the one holding the lantern that reveals how the path unfolds. If this resonated, write this sentence in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. I am the one who observes. And if you felt this shift, if you want to go deeper into this way of seeing, choose one of the videos appearing on your screen now. They continue exactly from here.